This lecture is about constraints and adaptations. This is actually the reason I'm here in front of you today. I started at designation critiquing students' work as a volunteer, and then I got asked to do a guest lecture, and then the discussion started and me working here after that. So the reason I created this lecture originally was they're like, Mo, what did you learn in your career that students could benefit from? And I was like, a lot, but I don't know what. And then this just popped into my head as something that was really a painful experience for me. I'm going to go slightly out of order so that the part that's the case study is not recorded, because there's things that I'm going to tell about the story about my life that I'd like to share with you, but I'm putting this recording on the servers and everyone has access to it, so I don't necessarily want that necessarily to be recorded, but it's from a place where things did not go well that I can hopefully save you pain and anguish, and to know what the yellow flags are and to react accordingly. So I'm gonna give you the presentation without the case study in the recording, and then I'm gonna hit end, and then I'll share the case study with you. There'll be some interactive parts today, and some reading and some questions that are not rhetorical. A little trick of the trade here is having a blank slide at the beginning so that you're not distracted by what I'm saying like before. So now we got the intro slide. So this was back when they were designation. So it's the constraints that exist in design and in the world, and then how do you adapt to them? Make it great by making do with what you've got is the subtitle. And that's really what we're here to talk about. So why am I talking to you about this now? You're in phase 4 with a client in the real world, and the real world isn't perfect. So there's constraints. You're going to run into constraints. You've already run into constraints before, but now the ante has been upped, and the stakes are higher. So I'm trying to get ahead of that. So when you do work with a client who has limited budget, limited access to users, a company that's run by one person almost entirely, they don't have the bandwidth, that's a constraint. So how do you adapt? So can I have somebody read this excerpt here?
Every task involves constraints. Solve the thing without constraint. There are magic links and chains. Forged to lose are rigid frames. Structures through the bind strangely liberate the mind.
So this poem really exemplifies how I see constraints. You can see constraints as a burden that's stopping us from doing blue sky thinking. But we live in the real world, and if you want to impact and improve the real world, you have to accept there's certain things you have to work around. And it's great design that thrives and succeeds because of, not in spite of, these constraints. So right now you're in academia, and so there's fewer constraints on you, but you'll be transitioning into the unknown environment where there's more constraints, they're interconnected, and that kind of thing. So this lecture will help you kind of acknowledge that and kind of transition there. So I've kind of alluded to some of these things, but what do you do as a designer, as a researcher, as an advocate for best practices when you don't have access to users at all? Not even just fewer than you'd like. You don't have access to a single one. What do you do? The term user-centered design isn't a term the stakeholder understands, has ever heard, may not agree with that because they like the color blue, and gosh darn it, the site's going to be blue. And if you don't have time to finish things, where do you cut corners and how do you think about that? So you can do them the best you can within your abilities. So case study will be third. And I've already made the link available of the non-case study version. So we're going to go from 1 to 3. And so we're in 1 right now. So overview. So a constraint and an adaptation. These are words I'll be using all the time. And for those of you that are keeping track, scoring, or maybe even creating a bet on how many times I use a word, you know who you are. Come up with a number now of how many times you think I will say the word constraint and adaptation. The winner will get some kind of candy bar, I guess, sure. So a constraint, can I have somebody read the definition of constraint?
A real or imagined limitation, restriction that constrains the parameters of one's work or the context in which work is done.
So real or imagined. There's this like crazy story of a guy that's stuck in jail, and there's no guard there to keep him there, but the bars are there, and he like tries to think about all these ways to escape, and he ends up wasting away his life and not escaping, and then he gets fed up and he like hits his head against the wall, and the door just opens like it was never locked. But it was a constraint to him because he had the perception that he was locked in jail. So some of these constraints can be too constraining, and maybe there's assumptions that you're making that they're there, but they're not really there. So I wanted to highlight that part. So adaptation, can somebody read that?
A modification of action or thought in response to a constraint. Adaptive responses move forward while taking reality into consideration.
So I've brought up mindfulness before in many ways to you guys as a group and individually. I'm really passionate about this topic. One of the core principles of mindfulness is that you respond, you do not react. React is mindless. Responding is thoughtful and with purpose. When you adapt, you do so mindfully, understanding how and why the constraints are there, if they are real, if they're direct, if they're indirect, if they're explicit or implicit. So these are the definitions. So simply, constraint, what you want to do but can't. Adaptation, will you respond or just react? How about you guys prior to Flatiron? When did you encounter a constraint? And perhaps with this new lens, how did you adapt? So real question, not rhetorical.
I don't know if this is the kind of example that you're looking for, but I took a class that was a lot about this kind of thing, and like the first assignment was laying out this set of rules, and you had to like figure out what you could do beyond those rules. So it was like make 3 hexagons and create a composition on a 10 by 10 sheet of paper that makes some of the hexagons look like they're in front of the others. And it was like the amount of like creative solutions that people came up with to address that problem, like using different textures of paper and like putting things in different, like what if you, instead of having the paper like flat on the wall, what if it is perpendicular to the wall? Like just really, like there are so many, like when you had the set of rules defined, it gives you something to like push off of and figure out like, okay, what's like a way that I could get around this one random rule.
Yeah.
And it like,
yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is that there were a set of constraints that were explicit in directions, and it forced the people engaging with these directions to really break apart the problem and critically think about the components of the solution in a new way that generated solutions that may not have existed otherwise. Yeah. Anybody else?
I've lived in like 10 apartments in the last 9 years, and like every time you search, it's always come down to a trade-off between location, price, and nicety.
Yeah.
And if you're like living with someone else, it's another dimension. So I adapt by like rank scoring.
Yeah. So
Trying to find the best value at the intersection.
trade-offs are another way to think about constraint. You don't have unlimited time, energy, money, budget. If you do ever have that, let me know. I'd love to get involved with whatever you're doing. But it's not likely, right? So I think that's a really good example of a real world day-to-day where, there's constraints, but without constraints, like you could go on forever and never really finish, So one more.
There's a lot, like when I was going through art school, like especially when you're starting, they teach you purposefully constraints where it's like, hey, you're gonna start by painting in like just black and white and not worry about color at all. And once you get to color, you start with what's called a limited palette.
Yeah.
Literally like black and then like earth tones.
Yeah.
Like, just really, really dull colors, and you have to adapt by like literally changing the way you see to like make something that looks like what you're seeing generally. Everything has relative value to everything else.
Yeah.
But you can only use this like garbage palette that you have in front of you.
Yeah, totally. And often you can add your own constraints strategically, which sounds like, what? Why would I limit myself? But there's a lot of benefits to constraints, which we're going to explore, so it might make sense to do that. Arguably, your users have constraints in their own lives. And the more you understand their lives, the more you can understand their constraints, and the better you can help them adapt to theirs. So this goes both ways, you know? So, okay. The art of responding to a constraint. So first we've got to break it up. I've already alluded to some of these things. So you can have a real and absolute constraint. So it's inevitable or immutable. Gravity is often a constraint we deal with every day, although with the ice today, maybe it doesn't really feel like it at times. So friction, all these things think about that. The constraint of gravity is why all sports are amazing and fun. Maybe there's going to be great zero-G sports in the future, but there'll be different constraints with different sports. So think about how the constraint of gravity has shaped all of the things that are involved in sports, that kind of thing. So without it falling to the ground, a ball would not be fun to kick. Real and malleable, so permeable or limited. There are things that are contextual, maybe are not as rigid and don't exist. So maybe it's like real or malleable would be like a good example of that one. So it may be that your energy level is that way. Yes, you have a limit. Some days it's higher, some days it's lower, and it's something that can change and is flexible and elastic. And then imagine perceived, assumed, but not real. So you might set a bar really high in quality or speed, and that's a constraint that you put on yourself. It may be imagined. Or a constraint may be a preference that's not, it's real in the sense that somebody has it, but it's so subjective that it's not something that's, has to be there. But if a stakeholder is very stubborn, that goes from something that is imagined to something that becomes real and absolute, in your world, that kind of thing. So in your world, it's a real one, but it's kind of a created one. So you can't really respond to something if you don't acknowledge that it's there. So we talk about kicking off projects, laying down assumptions, laying down questions. You can put constraints down as a new thing that you do in a project, and really to have those top of mind at the beginning. So I'm not going to go over all these, but these are examples. These aren't everything that you could run into of categories of constraints, but by definition, creating a persona constrains your design solution. Problem scoping, problem framing, that's constraining yourself. Compliance, laws and regulations, when we were talking about the open government initiative, there's that. Technical, can your developers do what you need them to do? Can they realize your vision? So just take a moment to look at some of these, and you can take a look later. But there's a lot of ways that you can categorize these. So the anatomy of a constraint, so divergent forces, creativity, art, doing all the things you could possibly do, and convergent forces, what do you have time to do, what do you have the ability to do? So just like the double diamond, divergent, convergent, they're used together. In the middle is where what you aspire to do and what you're actually able to do. There's an ecosystem of constraints. So if these two if the circle represents a constraint, think of all the constraints together, they form a pattern, they form an image. This is your problem space, and your solution opportunity space is formed of lots of different constraints. And only by taking a step back, taking that 1,000-foot view we talk about as designers, zooming in and zooming out, can you begin to see where do you want to play, and where do you want to push the boundaries or accept the boundaries. So these are a couple ways that famous designers have thought about constraints. And I'm breaking a rule that I have made for you guys when I'm talking about presentations, which is show one quote at a time. So I'm hypocritical in the moment. I acknowledge this fact. This was a design that was made a while ago, and I haven't updated it. So anyways, I'm going to read these two. Let limitations guide you to create solutions. There's never enough to go around, not enough time, not enough money, not enough people. That's a good thing. Instead of freaking out about these constraints, embrace them. Let them guide you. Constraints drive innovation and forces focus. Instead of trying to remove them, use them to your advantage. Teams that identify constraints early on and adapt accordingly are going to be more successful. So I encourage you guys to think about this. So that's from the one of the founders of Basecamp, making a project manager software, task management. Charles Eames, famous furniture designer. Design depends largely on constraints, the sum of all constraints. Here is one of the few effective keys to the design problem. The ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible, his or her willingness and enthusiasm for working within these constraints of price, size, strength, balance, surface, time, and so forth. Each problem has its own peculiar list. Each project, each client has its own context. So these are some other quotes you can read on your own. Not gonna beat a dead horse on that, but let's think about it. Really, what is the benefit of a constraint? If I told you to write the great American novel, and I came back a couple months later, how many of you would actually have that completed? Probably not many of you. But if I asked you to write a satirical blog post on Medium, I've constrained the genre, I've constrained the medium, I've constrained the length. More people in the room would likely succeed. But if I said write a haiku about birds in an hour, I've given you a time limit, I've given you a very constrained format and a subject matter. All of you can do that. So think of the constraints, like what constraints are you working on to create your MVP? What's the smallest thing you can make to make it more likely? Constraints are a way to think about that. We don't have time, we don't have all the money, so we're gonna do something. So MVP comes out of constraints. And when you only have so much time and money, you wanna do the smallest thing, smallest effort, biggest impact, best return on investment. So that comes from constraints. That's also the design process is about reducing risk and increasing the likelihood that you will learn from failure if risk occurs. So the constraints allow you to figure out what are the biggest constraints that you have, what are the biggest assumptions, what are the biggest risks, and mitigate those with the design process. So, research has been done on constraints, so your attention is focused. Things get more manageable. There's the paradox of choice. If you're given like 50 options, you get overwhelmed. Our brain is not good at processing these things. Emotionally, you get overwhelmed and you're less productive. So, versus ruthless prioritization. Talk about that a lot in phase 4 with clients and engaging with businesses. So here's where constraints come from in a different lens. The stage of the company. So talking about lean startup here, going from the problem solution fit, you only have so many users, a small amount of users. At the end, you have a lot of users, and that's time on the X, users on the Y. So from problem solution to product market to scale. So at each stage of the company, you're gonna have different constraints because they're gonna have more money at scale, but now you're dealing with problems that are more complex, more personas, more anti-personas, secondary, it's getting more intense and more complicated, the stakes are higher. Design maturity models. Envision did a really good job, I think it's called the Design Genome Project or something like that, where they interviewed all these companies, how far along is your design maturity? Well, what is design maturity? It's okay, no design maturity, nobody in the business practices design, they don't outsource design. Design is something that they're not infusing into the company, it's not top down from the CEO down. They don't have processes to make design easy for you. You have to source all users, you have to figure that out. So if you're the first design hire, low maturity model. Versus a big company like Google, they have had design influence their entire company, and not just design as surface level, but design as strategy, design as differentiation. So Doubly Design Office, Adaptive Path, they created their own design maturity models. So let's start with Adaptive Path. Going from stage 0 to stage 4, intuition, let's say you're working at Adaptive Path with a client and they come in, what is stage 0? Intuition. People are doing design, but it's all based on gut. There's no user research, there's no best practices based on secondary research. Then user behavior, they're doing some research about people, they're tracking analytics, metrics, quantitative data, then project value is not just like being reactive to what the user wants, but like saying, hey, we can add value by discovering more things and making the things that matter at the company. Business strategy is like not just at the project, but at the business level, the portfolio of projects and services and offerings. And then market strategy, how does our company really up the game, disrupt an industry, that kind of thing. So, the constraints that you're going to have at a stage 0 are going to be different, obviously, So these are ways to think about design maturity. Design is separate, it's outsourced, it's peripheral. So when it gets around to it, and the things that don't matter, the smaller projects, to central, there's one designer, they work on a really high-profile thing, versus integrated. Design is everywhere throughout the company. Even non-designers are fluent in design terminology. They know how to collaborate, do workshops, that kind of thing. Steelcase is a really good example of an integrated design maturity model. The Steelcase, based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, they make furniture. The head of Steelcase, the head of IDEO, they're best buds. I did a contract job there where I worked with only, probably 30 non-designers. All of them knew what journey mapping was. All of them knew what personas were. They were just ready to go, because that's what it's like to work at a furniture company called Steelcase. It's crazy. But they took a long time to get there. They are the exception to the rule. They really hide design maturity. Design maturity changes, and it's not linear. It's more logarithmic or exponential. What's the difference between those two mathematically? I have no idea, because I'm not a mathematician, and that was a while since high school. But basically, you can see there's a difference between linear and nonlinear, and so things happen slowly and then change more drastically as time goes on. So design capability. So we've got no business model on the left to validated business model on the right. And then we have a problem at the bottom, the middle of the solution at the top of the market. So, Aqua's design thinking, Maroon is lean startup, design sprint is a process that Google created and popularized, and then Agile or Scrum. So these all overlap, and we've had prior lecture of how these things work, but depending on, we're an Agile shop, is a place you can work at that practices Agile or Scrum. They do things differently, and they're working in a different area of the validated business model. There's different constraints that don't take place. No business model, it's what do we do? This blue sky, you have to create your more constraints for yourself versus the world creating them for you. So this is just to say different disciplines, different approaches are appropriate at different times, and when you're at a different time, at a different company, doing different things, the constraints are all going to be different. So you can picture if you created a list of constraints based on whatever you were doing, they could all be color-coded constraints if you were doing some kind of design activity to correlate with the design process that you would use to adapt to those constraints. So this is kind of high level, very conceptual, but being mindful of where you are in the design process, understanding what design process you are in or should be in, will help you identify what constraints might come up, essentially. There's a different way to think about it. There's not enough time in the lecture to really explain every single graph, but essentially this adds growth hacking to the design disciplines of scaling from design thinking to lean, agile, and so forth. And you just kind of have to know where you are on the process. And this isn't ideal platonically, but it's usually a mashup of this, or the company doesn't even know they're in one. So yeah, company culture. You can take, this is a little dated, but you can take a look at the average user or the persona of the brand, of what are the different social media types. So I worked at a company that their company culture was we tried it once, why should we try it again? And that was a constraint I had to beat my head against, a bunch. So something like that. Company structure. I think this is very telling if you ever think about how a company works. Why do they have the products the way they do? Apple extremely centralized, Google extremely decentralized. Think of the products, think of the business models, think of the personalities, think of the news stories. The products you use exist in the way they do because of the way the companies are organized to do the work. Doing design at these 6 companies is going to feel a lot different. It's going to produce different results. So my favorite one is the Microsoft one. This is from the 90s, where it was very antagonistic. Internally, people very much fought for resources and jockeyed for time for CEOs, and arguably dropped the ball in a lot of ways. They are no longer like this, but at one point they were, and they, yeah, love it, love that drawing. Holacracy versus hierarchy. So are things more, distributed, decentralized, more democratic, or are things more bureaucratic? How are things organized at the company that you might be working with or working for? I'll give you a second. This is politics. Gets messy. Some of these things aren't necessarily the most, PC, but let's be real. People are messy. There's weird dynamics that happen at companies that you have to work around. Knowing what's going on in the room is very important to know what to say, when to say it, how to say it, that kind of thing. So, team structure. So we talk a lot about in design thinking, desirability or design, feasibility, engineering, and viability or business. So look how nice and wonderful that symmetrical, Gesundheit, that symmetrical Venn diagram looks. But, and this is how it kind of plays out in terms of roles of interaction design, engineering. I created this diagram when I was trying to create more cohesion at user testing and talking about how we're going to work together, hopefully in the future, and try to socialize the power of design by advocating for more collaboration. So, and then, in design sprints, everybody gets in the same room and they all work for a week together. That's what that looks like. But these are, other possibilities. Like here, design is not even attached to the other disciplines. There, it's kind of a Russian doll situation. And then in the lower right, they're not connecting at all. So, a lot of companies who produce good work, you join their company or you work with a project and you're kind of like, wow, I thought based on using your software you were this, but really in the lower right, you're all separate in a big dumpster fire, and I can't believe you even survived as a company as long as you did. There's that a lot. So, and there's great companies too, but you got to really kind of be aware of what you're dealing with, and these are all the aspects to break down. So communication and translation, are you literally working with somebody across the world who speaks a different language? Do engineers speak in code and you don't? Learning their language, meeting them halfway, that kind of thing. When you speak, is it actually getting through, or is it mumble jumble and jumbled up in the other person's head? How do you ensure that you're actually being heard? So themes and resources. So books you can read about constraints, websites these are all working links that you can click on in the link in the calendar that has this deck. So you can read them at your own leisure. Articles about constraints that I use to inform this deck. Adaptability. So these are the themes: resourcefulness, being scrappy, asking for help when your instructors wish they could have more time with you but do not have the time, when your peers in the other cohort are only a couple weeks ahead of you. I do this all the time in my own job, at every job I've ever been in. I belong to Slack groups for designers, LinkedIn groups for teachers, Facebook groups for community builders, Reddit groups for all these things. How do I work around the constraints that, when a student doesn't speak English and I don't know how to help a student with English as a second language, how do I reach out to the global community of people that have been doing that their entire life and learn from them and quickly get ramped up so that I can support a student? That's an example of how I've had a constraint very recently, tried to do that when there's not enough time to resources at the company to address student issues in the way that is ideal. We're all doing the best we can, so that's an example. Building a team mentality, so not being afraid to ask out and really trying to push for multi-disciplinary collaborative teams so that your constraints can be looked at from multiple perspectives. Discussion about trade-offs, which we talked about with renting an apartment. So collaboration. Here are different ways to think about how you can enable full participation so the constraints can be fully pushed back against and fully adapted around. Mindset, so doing the best you can is usually good enough. We talk about that all the time in the curriculum. Satisficing over maximizing, so not being a perfectionist. Specificity is often better than accuracy. You can always improve if you iterate. Not taking it too personally, staying focused on the user, but keeping business top of mind. So how do you have trade-offs visualized and explained? How do you think about the rational and the emotional parts about dealing with those trade-offs? So yeah, Resilience and Grit, great book, Grit, about grit, which I didn't list here, but there's that. And just, getting knocked down, getting back up, and learning from it. Showcasing value. So when you have a constraint that is malleable, that doesn't have to be there, work within it, and then do research or experiments or show how without the constraint it could be better, or showcase how design can have impact with constraints and it could have been so much better if those were considered earlier. So really proving by doing rather than like asking before you do. So before I get into the case study, to really make it come to life, are there any questions or thoughts about constraints? If you disagree with any of these things, because intuitively, feeling constrained, being constrained, not having freedom in the land of America, the land of the free and the brave, I think we're raised to believe that constraints are bad and choice and more is always good. So challenge me if you feel any reason that you don't think any of this is true. Because, this is one sliver of a part of the truth, so.
Do you find it's easiest to address these right away, to ask our stakeholders, what are your constraints, or did you sort of figure these out as you went along the project brief?
I think having that conversation as part of the kickoff is really important, yeah.
Sooner rather than later, but then I guess in the brief we already know what some of the constraints are. But,
Well, there's constraints from a project brief perspective, but knowing the full picture about the company and the people and the context that they're in at this point in time that aren't about the project. Because the project exists within a company. Yeah.